The night had bled into a pale, gray morning, leaving the sky swollen with clouds that pressed low against the earth. Rain clung to the wooden slats of the barn, dripping from the roof in steady rhythms, each drop striking the mud like the ticking of a slow and merciless clock. Inside, Ethan Ward worked alone. His hands were rough, calloused, and shaking just enough to betray how little he had slept. The barn smelled of hay and damp earth, and somewhere in the shadows a horse shifted uneasily, its hooves scraping against the floorboards. Ethan's world had grown quieter since his wife's passing, but not in the kind of peace one welcomes. Silence weighed down on him, stretching between chores, filling the house at night, whispering through empty rooms that once rang with laughter. The ranch, once alive with her touch, now seemed to resist him at every turn. Fences splintered. The roof sagged. The soil refused to yield. The animals sensed his weariness too. None more so than Shadow, the black horse with scars lacing his flank, who had come to him broken and untamed. Shadow was a mirror Ethan sometimes wished he didn't have to look into. The horse's mistrust was etched in every sidelong glance, every flinch when Ethan reached too quickly. Yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan had kept him, maybe because he saw something familiar in the animal's eyes, grief that refused to heal, a wound too deep to name. That morning, the storm had loosened part of the barn wall, and Ethan went to fix it. He gathered his tools, muttering under his breath as the hammer slipped in his damp hand. When he stepped onto the worn planks of the floor, they groaned beneath his weight. He bent low, nails clamped between his teeth, and raised the hammer. The sound that followed was unexpected. A sharp crack, then nothing. The hammer had slipped from his grip and vanished. Ethan frowned, kneeling down. He pressed his ear against the floorboard where the tool had disappeared, listening. A hollow echo answered him, deep and resonant, as though the barn's foundation hid more than dirt. He set aside the nails and pried at the wood with the claw of another hammer. The plank lifted easily, almost too easily, as though it had been replaced once before and never properly secured. Beneath it, a gap yawned, dark and strange, a pocket of air where solid earth should have been. His fallen hammer lay on a slope of stone, the metal faintly glinting in the low light. Shadow snorted, stamping at the ground, ears flicking back. Ethan looked over, his brow furrowed. "Easy," he muttered, though his own chest tightened with unease. The air rising from the gap was cooler than it should have been, damp and laced with the mineral smell of caves. He crouched at the edge, running his hand over the stones lining the walls of the hole. It wasn't natural. These rocks had been cut, shaped, stacked by hands long gone. His pulse quickened. Questions rushed forward faster than he could frame them. Who had built this? Why here beneath his barn? How far did it go? Ethan sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the chill. He told himself to leave it alone, to nail the boards back down, and forget the hollowness beneath. The ranch had enough problems without him chasing shadows underground. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. There was something about that space, something that pulled at him the way his wife's voice had in the last days, gentle, insistent, carrying a weight he could not ignore. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house pressing against his thoughts. Memories rose unbidden. His wife humming as she stitched curtains, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had looked at him with quiet certainty even when the doctors had shaken their heads. Her voice, faint as the wind, seemed to drift through the dark now, whispering a single phrase, "Look deeper." By the time the first light of dawn seeped into the sky, Ethan was already dressed. He filled a lantern with oil, its glass smudged and old but reliable. Shadow watched him from his stall, ears tilted forward, gaze sharp and restless. Ethan crossed the barn, his boots heavy on the boards. He knelt at the gap once more, widening it enough for his shoulders to fit through. The lantern flickered in his grip, casting thin orange light against the stone walls below. The darkness seemed endless, as though it swallowed everything beyond the narrow ring of flame. For a long moment, he stood there wavering. He could feel the weight of his exhaustion pressing him back, telling him he had no right to chase after mysteries when bills piled on the table, when animals needed feeding, when the world above ground was already breaking him apart. But something deeper urged him forward, a current too strong to resist. He lowered the lantern, watching the light fall onto the steps carved into the earth. His breath caught. These were not the crude marks of an accident, nor the simple remains of some forgotten storm cellar. These were deliberate, crafted, leading downward into a place that had been hidden for longer than he could imagine. Behind him, Shadow whinnied, the sound echoing off the barn walls. Ethan turned, meeting the horse's dark eyes. In them, he saw the same uncertainty that gnawed at his own chest, but also a kind of challenge, as if the animal were daring him not to falter. He swallowed hard, set his jaw, and lowered himself to sit at the tunnel's mouth. The lantern light trembled, painting his face in shifting gold. His boots brushed against the first stone step, and he felt the cold of the underground seep into his bones. Ethan took one last glance at the barn, the broken walls, the sagging beams, the fragments of a life he no longer knew how to repair. Then he looked back into the darkness, into the place where silence waited, heavy with secrets. With a sharp inhale, he rose, gripping the lantern firmly. "All right," he murmured under his breath, his voice low but steady. "Let's see what you're hiding." The lantern flame flared as if in answer. Shadow shifted, hooves scraping once more, his breath rising in white clouds against the cold. Ethan took his first step downward, the sound echoing into the void, and the tunnel swallowed him whole. The air pressed against him as he descended, thick and damp, filled with the scent of stone that had not felt the sun in decades. Ethan held the lantern high, its glow trembling across the narrow walls. The tunnel was cramped, barely wide enough for him to pass without scraping his shoulders, the stonework rough beneath his fingertips. Each step downward carried the weight of a choice he no longer had the will to undo. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the hiss of the flame and the steady thud of his boots. Every sound seemed amplified, bouncing down the passage until it felt as though something unseen walked just behind him, matching his pace. He paused once, lantern held close to his chest, his breath clouding in the cool air. The shadows stretched too far, shifting as though alive. He forced himself forward. After several minutes, the tunnel widened. The ceiling arched higher, carved with a precision that unsettled him. He ran his hand across the marks, tracing grooves that looked deliberate, almost like symbols or initials worn thin by time. His mind scrambled for explanations. Smugglers? Miners? Or something his father had known and never spoken of. Ethan's throat tightened at the thought of his father. The man's voice rose unbidden in his memory, harsh and relentless. Work harder. Stand straighter. No weakness. As a boy, Ethan had tried to earn approval with every chore, every race, every scraped knuckle. Nothing had been enough. Even when he'd taken to the rodeo circuit, chasing the fleeting glory of the arena, his father had dismissed him with a shake of the head. A waste of time. A fool's game. Those words had stuck deeper than any spur. The lantern flame flickered as he moved forward again, drawing him deeper into the stone throat of the earth. His chest ached with something heavier than fear. Regret. Failure. The kind of weight that dragged a man down long before the ground took him. Shadow's image lingered in his mind, the horse's wary gaze mirroring the same mistrust he carried for himself. Perhaps that was why the animal stayed, despite every reason to bolt. Perhaps broken things recognized each other. The tunnel sloped downward until it opened into a chamber. Ethan stopped at its threshold, his breath catching. The space stretched wider than the barn above, its walls lined with shelves carved directly into the rock. On them lay objects that time had nearly consumed, rusted tools, shattered lanterns, leather straps stiff with age. The floor was scattered with scraps of paper, their ink blurred but still bearing traces of handwriting. He stepped carefully, the echo of his boots carrying through the hollow space. His lantern light fell across a corner where a stack of crates lay, their wood blackened but intact. One bore a faint marking, 2 letters carved deep. J.W. Ethan frowned, brushing his hand across the grooves. His father's initials were H.W., but his grandfather's name had been James. The possibility twisted something in Ethan's gut. Could this place have belonged to his own bloodline? He crouched, prying at one of the crates, but the lid held firm. His eyes shifted instead to the wall, where more carvings ran along the stone. Names. Dates. Faded so badly they seemed to bleed into one another, but one stood out. 1924. He whispered the year aloud, the sound fragile in the dark. Whoever had carved it had stood where he now stood, lantern in hand, secrets locked tight in their chest. Ethan wandered toward the center of the chamber, where the ground dipped slightly. There, half buried in dirt, lay an object that seemed out of place among the dust. He knelt and pulled it free, a leather-bound journal, swollen from moisture but still intact. The clasp resisted him, but with a grunt, it snapped open. Pages crackled beneath his fingertips. The handwriting was bold, firm, the kind of script men used when they believed their words mattered. He skimmed fragments by the dim light. Mentions of horses, of breeding lines hidden away, of land disputes that had turned violent. Words like safe passage and tunnel routes leapt at him. Ethan's pulse quickened. This was no simple cellar. This was a network, a refuge, perhaps even a place where people had hidden from danger. The deeper he read, the more questions clawed at him. Why had this been buried beneath his barn? Why had no one spoken of it? A sudden sound snapped him upright. A creak, faint but sharp, from above. He froze, lantern lifted, heart pounding against his ribs. It had come from the direction of the barn. He strained his ears, holding his breath. Again, a thud, the unmistakable sound of footsteps overhead. Ethan closed the journal with a snap, shoving it under his arm. He extinguished the lantern flame with a quick puff, plunging himself into near darkness. The black pressed in, suffocating, every instinct screaming at him to flee. He retraced his steps through the tunnel, each stride faster than the last, boots scraping stone, hands grazing the walls to guide him. The silence was broken now, fractured by the memory of that sound. Someone was up there. When he reached the base of a ladder, his breath came ragged, sweat stinging his eyes. He climbed quickly, forcing himself not to think of what, or who, waited above. The barn light spilled through the opening, pale and ghostly. He emerged, pushing the boards aside, heart hammering as though it might burst. The barn was not empty. The door swayed in the breeze, creaking on its hinges. Dust hung in the air, unsettled. Shadow shifted violently in his stall, nostrils flared, eyes wide. The horse's alarm sent a chill straight through Ethan. He scanned the corners, the shadows, searching for movement. Nothing. Only the sense that something had just slipped out of sight. He clutched the journal tighter, his knuckles white. Whoever had been here knew about the tunnel, knew enough to come looking. The thought hollowed him out with dread. He glanced at Shadow, whose body remained taut, ears pinned, as if the threat still lingered just beyond reach. "Who's out there?" Ethan's voice cracked the stillness, low and sharp. The barn swallowed the words and gave no answer. The only reply was the restless snort of his horse and the groan of the door as the wind pushed it wider. Ethan stood rooted, the journal pressed against his chest, the weight of it heavier than iron. He had uncovered something buried for nearly a century, and already it had drawn another's footsteps to his door. His life, which had felt so still, so drained of meaning, now pulsed with a dangerous kind of urgency. He did not know yet whether it was gift or curse, but he knew one thing: he was not alone anymore. The following days passed in a haze of unease. Ethan worked the ranch in silence, but his mind remained fixed on the journal tucked beneath the loose floorboard in his bedroom. He returned to it at night, poring over its damp pages, tracing each word with a kind of reverence. The entries spoke of horses unlike any he had known, animals bred for endurance, trained for silence, moved through hidden paths that connected ranches like a web beneath the land. The words carried a sense of urgency, warnings of disputes that had nearly turned to blood. Yet what struck Ethan most was the care with which they had been written, as though the author believed future eyes would need them. Every time Ethan lifted his gaze from the page, he thought of the sound he had heard above the tunnel, the footsteps that did not belong to him. Whoever had been there had not returned, but the sense of being watched lingered like a shadow clinging to the corners of his barn. Shadow himself grew restless, pacing his stall, ears twitching at unseen things. The horse's agitation seeped into Ethan until he too could no longer shake the feeling that something waited just beyond sight. It was on the third morning that he saw her. A figure approaching the ranch, moving with determined strides down the dirt path, her coat snapping in the wind. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and searching even from a distance. Ethan stepped out of the barn to meet her, jaw clenched, heart thudding with wary anticipation. "Mr. Ward," she called, her voice clear and steady. He nodded but said nothing, wiping his hands on his jeans. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with the kind of focus that made him feel like the journal itself, cracked open and vulnerable. "My name is Clara Morales," she said. "I'm a historian. I think you've found something that belongs to my family." Ethan's stomach nodded. He searched her face for deceit, but found only certainty. "You've been on my land?" he asked, his tone harsher than intended. Her chin lifted. "I've been searching for records tied to my grandfather." He disappeared nearly 70 years ago. The last trace of him led here to this valley. I know about the tunnels, and I know you've seen them. Ethan's grip tightened on the rag in his hand. The world he thought he had uncovered alone suddenly felt invaded. Yet there was something in her eyes that echoed his own, the pull of unfinished history, the ache of questions left to rot in silence. Against his instinct to shut the door on strangers, he found himself saying, "Come inside." They sat at the worn kitchen table, the journal between them. Clara's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her eyes glistening when she found a name scribbled in the margin. "Rafael Morales," she whispered. "My grandfather." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, as though steadying herself. Ethan watched her, something shifting in him. Her search was not so different from his own, though he had not admitted it until now. They were both chasing ghosts in ink and stone, both tethered to people who had left them with more silence than answers. "What do you want with it?" he asked. She looked up, her expression fierce now. "The truth. For my family. For yours too, whether you realize it or not. These tunnels weren't just passages. They were lifelines. People risked everything to keep them secret, and someone wanted that secret buried." Her words stirred something he had not expected, the image of his father, standing rigid and unspeaking, always holding more than he revealed. Could it be that even his father had carried fragments of this hidden world, locked away behind stern eyes? The thought unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. In the days that followed, Clara stayed. She walked the property with him, recording details, sketching markings, coaxing meaning from things Ethan had overlooked. At first, he resented her intrusion, but gradually he began to see the value in her presence. She asked questions he never would have considered, challenged his assumptions, forced him to look not only at the tunnel but at himself. Shadow became the bridge between them. Clara had a way with the horse, patient yet unyielding, and under her touch the animal began to soften. Ethan watched astonished as Shadow allowed her to brush his coat without flinching, to guide him gently with a lead rope. Clara explained techniques her grandfather had used, methods that valued trust over force, patience over dominance. Slowly, Ethan began to imitate her, his movements growing less rigid, his voice gentler. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of connection, not only with the horse, but with another human being. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Clara and Ethan returned to the tunnel together. They carried the lantern, the journal, and a crowbar to pry open the crates. The chamber welcomed them with the same damp chill, but now the space felt less like a tomb and more like a waiting story. They worked side by side, their breath clouding in the cold air, until one crate yielded. Inside lay saddles, blankets, and papers sealed in wax. Clara gasped when she unrolled one of the documents, a map drawn by hand marking the network of tunnels stretching across the valley. Ethan's gaze caught on a photograph tucked into the bundle. His breath faltered. It showed two men standing proudly beside a horse, dust swirling at their boots. One was unmistakably Clara's grandfather. The other, Ethan's father, younger, softer around the edges, a smile rare enough that Ethan barely recognized it. The discovery struck him harder than he expected. For years, he had carried the image of a father who was only stern, only cold. Now here was proof of a man capable of camaraderie, perhaps even courage. The photograph rattled loose something he had buried deep, the possibility that his father had not been simply cruel, but burdened by secrets too heavy to share. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the picture until his vision blurred. Clara placed a hand gently on his arm, her voice quiet. "You see now, they were in this together. Whatever they were protecting, it mattered." He nodded, though words refused to come. His chest felt raw, torn open, but there was a strange relief in it too, as though the silence of his past had cracked just enough to let air in. When they left the chamber that night, Ethan carried the photograph with him, the weight of it pressing close to his heart. But the world outside offered no peace. Parked at the edge of the dirt road was a black truck, its engine idling, headlights cutting through the dusk. A figure sat inside watching. Clara stiffened beside him. Ethan's hand closed around the photograph, his pulse quickening. The journals, the tunnels, the legacy, they were no longer secrets, safely buried. Others wanted them. And Ethan knew with a clarity sharper than fear that his fight was only beginning. He glanced at Shadow in the barn, the horse lifting his head, eyes gleaming in the half-light. Ethan whispered under his breath, steady but fierce, "We fight." The black truck returned every few days, always parked just far enough to remind Ethan that someone was watching. No one stepped out, no voice called across the distance, but the threat was undeniable. Clara urged caution, yet her resolve never faltered. She believed the journals and maps could secure the ranch as a historic site, protected from developers. Ethan wasn't sure he trusted the world to care about history when money hung in the balance. But with every glance at the photograph of his father and Clara's grandfather, something inside him hardened. He could not allow the story to vanish beneath bulldozers and dust. Shadow had become the heart of his resolve. The horse no longer shied from his touch, no longer pulled back when Ethan approached with a halter. Their connection grew through hours of training, sweat mixing with patience, frustration giving way to understanding. Clara stood by them, guiding his movements, teaching him the subtle language of trust. Each small victory, a steady trot, a moment of eye contact, a calm stand, built toward something larger. The endurance race was announced in town, a tradition that had survived generations. Clara pressed him to enter. "It's not just about winning," she told him one evening, her voice carrying over the sound of crickets. "It's about proving what Shadow can do. What you can do. People will listen when they see it with their own eyes." Ethan resisted at first. The thought of stepping into the public eye, of opening himself to failure in front of the same community that whispered about his failing ranch, made his stomach knot. But the truck's shadow on the horizon, the knowledge that silence was no longer protection, left him with little choice. He signed his name on the entry form, his hand trembling, and the decision carried the weight of a vow. The day of the race dawned clear, the sky stretched wide and merciless above the valley. Riders gathered with their horses, chatter rising in bursts of excitement and nerves. Ethan stood apart, adjusting Shadow's bridle with deliberate care. The horse's dark eyes met his, calm and steady, a mirror of the trust they had built. Clara squeezed his shoulder. "Ride like it matters," she whispered. "Because it does." The starter's whistle cut the air. Hooves thundered as the riders surged forward, dust rising in a thick cloud. Ethan kept Shadow at a measured pace, resisting the urge to chase the leaders. The course was brutal, steep climbs, rocky descents, rivers swollen from recent rains. He felt every muscle in his body strain, every breath a battle against the weight of exhaustion. Shadow stumbled once, nearly unseating him. Ethan's heart leapt, but he tightened his grip and steadied his voice. "Easy, boy. We've got this." The horse responded, regaining balance, pushing forward with renewed strength. Ethan remembered the journals, the words etched with care. "Endurance is not speed, it is will." The phrase echoed through him, guiding each stride. Hours stretched. Riders began to fall back, some dismounting, others leading their horses on foot. Ethan pressed on, his vision blurring with sweat, his legs burning. Memories assaulted him, his father's scorn, his wife's fading smile, the silence that had once suffocated him. He carried them all now, not as burdens but as fuel. Every mile was a reckoning, every breath a defiance. As the course neared its end, a final hill loomed, cruel in its steepness. Shadow faltered, sides heaving, and Ethan's body screamed in protest. He nearly slid from the saddle, his strength drained to nothing. For a heartbeat, he considered stopping, letting the weight of defeat crush him once more. Then he looked at Shadow, the horse's eyes blazing with determination. Broken once, but not now. Not anymore. "Go," Ethan whispered, his voice ragged. "Go, damn it." Shadow surged forward, gathering what strength remained. The world narrowed to the pounding of hooves, the rasp of breath, the searing burn of effort. Together they crested the hill, and as they descended, the finish line appeared, a ribbon of color, a roar of voices. Ethan clung to the reins, barely conscious, as Shadow carried him across. The crowd erupted. Clara was there, rushing forward, her face wet with tears, her voice breaking, as she called his name. Ethan slid from the saddle, collapsing to his knees, his hands buried in Shadow's mane. The horse stood tall, chest heaving but unbroken. The officials declared him the victor. More than that, they declared Shadow a marvel, a testament to endurance and spirit. The valley's attention turned, cameras flashing, reporters asking questions. Clara stepped forward, holding the journals high, her voice strong as she told the story of the tunnels, the heritage, the legacy of those who had come before. What had been rumor became truth in the eyes of the crowd. The ranch was no longer a failing relic, it was history worth saving. That night, the truck did not return. The threats that had lingered at the edges of the ranch dissolved beneath the weight of recognition. Papers were signed in the weeks that followed, preserving the land as a protected site, a place where history would be honored rather than erased. Ethan walked the barn in quiet reflection, the photograph of his father and Clara's grandfather pinned above the stall where Shadow rested. Clara remained by his side, her research continuing, her laughter filling the spaces that had once been barren. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive again, not with the ghosts of the past, but with the promise of something lasting. One evening, Ethan stood at the barn door, watching the horizon burn with the colors of sunset. Shadow grazed nearby, his coat gleaming in the light. Clara approached, her hand brushing his arm. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "We did it. Him and me." He nodded toward Shadow, his voice thick with quiet pride. "He carried me when I couldn't carry myself." For a long moment, they stood together, the silence no longer heavy, but full of possibility. Ethan felt the weight of his grief, his failures, his doubts, but they no longer defined him. They had been reshaped into something new, something stronger. He looked at the barn, at the hidden tunnel beneath, at the legacy carved into stone and sweat. He thought of his wife, of the voice that had once urged him to look deeper. He had, and it had led him here, to truth, to healing, to hope. "We're not finished yet," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and rain, the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan stepped into it without fear. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.